Hi, this is Steve Dale, and we're recording this on November 22nd here. And so our subject today is talking about MSP compliance here with Joe Anderson, who has been a partner here with GSPT from the beginning here. And also, I've known Joe for a long time.
Wow, yeah.
He's obviously a very young guy, so it was when he was in diapers. But Joe's been involved. And by the way, Medivest here, working with the founder. I've worked with him probably at least for 20 years, maybe longer. Here, the reason that we asked Joe to come today is that this is a subject that is always confusing. It's always in development, so I think I've heard this presentation probably a dozen times, and it's always a different presentation. I always pick up something, so this is a continually developing development. I know for those of us that are attorneys who do this work, the question we get all the time is, do I need to do an MSA? What do I do? What about all this stuff? Everybody has all these different opinions and all that, and a lot of times you're asked to give an opinion about this sort of thing. So, Joe's going to go through like not only the basics of MSAs and MSPs and all that, but also maybe bring us a little up to date with what's going on today.
Absolutely.
And once again, we're recording this in 2019, so the information we have will be good for, well, at least a period of time.
Small period, yeah.
A small period as we go. Joe's the Vice President of Business Development for Medivest, and Medivest is the leading provider of settlement solutions that assist settling parties to maintain in compliance for Medicare secondary payer obligations, including lien resolutions, custodial accounts, and Medicare Set Aside arrangements. Also, he is a frequent speaker all over the country. So, in fact, this is the first time I've seen you on the West Coast for some time. So usually I see him somewhere else.
Nice to be home.
Here. So anyway, prior to Medivest, Joe worked as a national structured settlement planning firm dedicated to providing analysis, design, and implementation of periodic payment packages and resolution of personal injury and wrongful death litigation, as well as innovative attorney fee structures relevant to class actions, taxable damages, and other non-traditional structured settlement cases. And the structured settlement industry is huge when it comes into this area. So oftentimes when you're doing this work, not only are you working with your MSP expert, but oftentimes you will have the structured folks involved in this. So with that, Joe, I'm going to thank you again for providing this information to our folks. The other thing that I'll just mention as we get into this is that here, and DJ, if you could put this slide up just for a moment here, that this program has been approved for 1 unit, and if it goes a little bit over, we may be able to squeeze a few more units into this here of MCLE credit by the State Bar of California. Here, the provider is the North Bay Housing Coalition. In order to get the credit, okay, what you're going to see is there are 3 codes that you need to write down here, and then email Amy at gspt.org here, and she'll send you not only all the handouts that go with the presentation, but a form for you to apply for MCLE credit. And there are some handouts and that kind of thing. Lastly, here, because we're doing this on the internet, if you have any questions, what you need to do is use the chat box and type the questions in, and then what Amy will do when we get to the end, if we do have questions, is we will ask Joe the questions here. And also, if for some reason you're not able to use the chat box, then if you email Amy at GSPT, then that's another way to reach her. Okay, Joe, with that here, I want to thank you so much for doing this. And then I'm going to slip out of here, and then let's see what you have to say.
All right.
Okay, so you go to the slide you need, and what we're going to do is good.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone out there joining us today. My goal, simply put, is hopefully you get something out of our time together, which I think if you do special needs planning or you're a trust and estate planning attorney, or you just have any desire to either work with trial attorneys on helping solve public benefit issues, the Medicare Set Aside issue can be a great catalyst to help engage with plaintiff counsel and help solve those public benefit issues. So, as Steve mentioned, we're going to start at a very high 30,000-foot view of what the heck MSP compliance is and distill our way on down to hopefully some pragmatic tips that you can take away and implement into your own practice. So with that, starting here on the first slide, you'll see what is the Medicare Secondary Payer Act. It's a federal statute that, simply put, means no double dipping is the best way to describe it, right? So as you'll see, there's the language on the screen there, but there are basically 5 primary plans of insurance that are considered primary to the Medicare coffers. And you'll see here on this next slide, we list them out right there, all 5. And in big, bold letters, you'll see liability as one of the primary plans of insurance. So from the onset, I know that there's a lot of gray or a lot of different interpretations on Medicare Secondary Payer Compliance, or MSAs, within the liability arena compared to work comp claims. Right from the beginning, we see the federal statute itself lists liability as a primary plan of insurance. So we know we must take Medicare's interest into account in some way when we're thinking about our insurance settlements on the liability side. So going on to the next slide, I'm going to give you a little bit of a timeline to kind of walk us from the creation of this statute all the way down to present day on, what is Medicare Secondary Payer Compliance, how it's evolved, and what are we doing today to create compliance or help solve public benefit issues with our clients and our attorneys as well. So in 1965, Medicare Trust Fund was created. The little known fact was the work comp line of insurance was the only line of insurance that was deemed primary to Medicare at the time. We fast forward down to 1980. Of course, no big surprise, the Medicare Trust Fund has always had solvency issues, right? Nothing's changed about that today. They create the Medicare Secondary Payer Statute. And again, that statute simply, no double dipping. If John Smith or Jane Doe is injured and they're receiving an insurance settlement, part of that settlement is contemplating future medical consideration. Medicare would like to see some of that money in that settlement award be utilized for future injury-related Medicare allowable expenses, right? So a portion of those settlement dollars will be essentially earmarked from the global settlement and used going forward to pay for some of those injury-related expenses, and thereby protects the Medicare coffers as a secondary payer. So it's a solution in place to help solve solvency issues without necessarily having to put more money into the budget or Medicare's coffers. So on the third bullet down there, we see from 1980 to 2001, we call it the 21 years of inactivity. Medicare creates a statute, and of course they do nothing about creating some scaffolding or some guidelines on how to be in line with the law that they just created. It's basically Scout's honor. So as you can probably imagine, nothing was done in the way of considering Medicare's interest in some of these settlements, and in fact, not even so much in work comp claims, and specifically, certainly nothing in liability claims until very recently, which we'll discuss here in a moment. So in May of 2001, the Government Accountability Office recommends a mandatory insurer reporting requirement. Now, the thing to consider about this is that, number one, the reporting requirement is of no responsibility to plaintiff counsel. However, it is a responsibility that falls on the shoulders of the defendant, but what's very important for plaintiff counsel to keep in mind is that this reporting requirement is the conduit of claim information that the payers send on to Medicare, so it does create a pool of data of health information so that they do have knowledge or awareness, right, of someone's needle of a case in a big haystack across the country of a bunch of cases going on. So when you get the question, do I have to do an MSA, or how would Medicare ever find out about my case, right? The first thing is, the implicit question behind do I have to do an MSA is, do I need to consider Medicare's interest? The second thing of how would they find out about my case is the evolution of this reporting requirement put in place for the payers. In July of 2001, there's a Patel memo that's famously created. A lot of people say that this is the origin of Medicare Set Asides. It's essentially just an idea or a concept that was proposed by a couple of attorneys that basically say a Medicare Set Aside is a carve-out of medical dollars from the global settlement that's earmarked for future medical expenses that are otherwise Medicare allowable expenses. From 2001 to present day, we have more and more memos that are further defining Medicare set-aside arrangements, as you probably will see if you do a quick search or you have a little bit of a history working with MSAs, that the vast majority of the information we have available to us out there is written within the workers' compensation arena and not so much on the liability side, which, as I mentioned when we kicked off this webinar today, there's a lot of varying opinions around liability MSAs for that reason, because we don't have a very specific set of commentary from Medicare on how to deal with MSP compliance on the liability side. And simply put, the reason for that is because work comp and liability are apples and oranges, right? So we can't necessarily just cookie cutter over the guidelines we have in place for the work comp claims and apply them to our liability settlements. So in 2003, the MSP is expanded, and we also start talking about conditional payments now. So you can bifurcate MSP compliance essentially into past payments, pre-settlements essentially, a lien, and future considerations, which is a Medicare set-aside of what we're talking about. But I'd like you to keep in mind that regardless of whether we're talking about liens or we're talking about future payment considerations in the form of an MSA, it all comes back or is tied back to the same federal statute. And that's important here for, in a couple of minutes here, I'm going to mention on some very recent cases where we see Medicare enforcing their recovery rights on liability cases. So to finish this timeline off, in December of 2007, we see the S-CHIP Extension Act signed. That's important because that tied the mandatory insurer reporting requirement to that. So what we all need to know today in 2019 heading into 2020 is that the reporting requirement is so small now that pretty much every single settlement is being reported. And there's a financial penalty put in place for payers that are found out of compliance. So needless to say, all payers are well aware of this, and they are all in compliance submitting claim information onto Medicare. So that's all to say, when you're advising your plaintiff attorney clients about MSAs or protecting Medicare's interest, it behooves everyone to realize that pretty much gone are the days of, you'll never find out about my case, it's okay to roll the dice and do nothing. Do nothing isn't a great strategy, and there's varying degrees of risk tolerance on down the line of doing a full Medicare set-aside, creating iterations of a Medicare set-aside, or striking a fine balance in between. So again, kind of walking our way down from the 30,000-foot view, getting down a little bit, we have the MSP statute, right? The federal statute that says no double dipping and explicitly names liability as one of the 5 primary plans of insurance. Now let's talk a little bit about what the heck is a Medicare set-aside. And as I mentioned, the Medicare set-aside is essentially a carve-out of future medical dollars that are earmarked. And the MSA is basically a 2-pronged test as you can think about these types of accounts. One, it has to be only considering injuries that are directly related to the lawsuit. So that's to say, nothing pre-existing or unrelated. Now, this is a big difference between work comp and liability, right? In work comp, the injuries are either accepted or denied. It's binary. It's in or it's out. In liability, it's very gray, right? We also have causation versus exacerbation issues to deal with. So right off the bat, we can already see how guidance in work comp must be treated differently than guidance in the liability arena. But back to the MSAs. So the first prong of this MSA test has to be an injury directly related to the lawsuit. And then number 2, tethered to that, it must be an otherwise Medicare allowable expense. That's to say, Medicare pays for a lot of things, right? But they don't pay for everything under the sun. So when we're thinking about these Medicare set-aside accounts, they're basically medical and prescription expenses, contemplating future care that are tied to the claim, and are also otherwise Medicare allowable expenses. So it's just a carve-out of the global settlement for medical expenses to consider going forward. And we'll take a quick pause here to give you some time to jot down the MCLE code. It is 6830. All right, we'll go ahead and continue. So we started with the Medicare Secondary Payer Act, right? The federal statute, no double dipping, explicitly names liability as a primary plan of insurance. We try to talk a little bit about what is a Medicare Set Aside, a global carve-out, two-pronged test, expenses directly tied to the claim, and otherwise Medicare allowable expenses. Now I want to talk a little bit about liability MSP compliance specifically. As I mentioned before, a lot of the guidance that we have, or at least just the information given to us for Medicare, has only been written into the work comp arena. Now, as time has gone on, Medicare has actually commented on MSP compliance within the liability arena. So again, another point or a talking point to bring up to your trial attorney colleagues when you're helping counsel them on public benefit preservation issues. When Medicare pops up into the picture or this discussion about Medicare Set Asides, if you get the comment or the question about, isn't this only a work comp issue, or Medicare hasn't said anything about MSP compliance in the liability space, you can give them a little bit of information and refer them back to some inflection points in time where Medicare absolutely has mentioned liability compliance specifically. So we start on the far bottom there in 1980, again, federal statute, explicitly names liability as a primary payer. Probably beaten that dead horse, but it's worth mentioning that the federal statute itself explicitly names liability. We move on down the line there. In 2009, we have the SCHIP reporting requirement. The same, it does not discriminate from work comp claims to personal injury settlements. So Medicare is getting the claim information whether you like it or not. 2012, we have an announcement for public rulemaking. We go through, the government has a specific procedure or operational process in place to develop, allow for commentary, and then eventually implement some rules for a specific area. This was kind of the first bite at the apple where they wanted to talk about specifically compliance or regulations around liability cases, and again, differing from work comp. Now we go to 2014, those proposed rules that were on the table for liability compliance were pulled. There's a lot of varying degrees of opinion on the internet of why those rules were pulled. Some people say it was as small as too much time has gone by, so they needed to go back to the table to reconsider. Other people say it was as significant as economic impact studies were done, and the unintended consequences, the ripple effect of those rules would have been disastrous. The fact of the matter is nobody knows for certain. However, there were rules that were proposed. They were on the table to be moved forward and be implemented. They were withdrawn. No one knows exactly why, but it's a strong indicator that Medicare has been sitting and thinking about implementing some guidance and scaffolding to operate within on the liability side. So, strong indicator. And as time goes on, we move to 2017. There is a change request notice, and technically, this was not a memo. Technically, this was a change request from Medicare sent to their contractors to help them amend what they refer to as a common working file. And the common working file is basically just a catch-all of information for an individual. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to add a section that allowed for information to be implemented about liability, Medicare Set Aside, what was the amount of the MSA, what were the ICD codes potentially about built into the MSA. So it did specifically talk about liability Medicare Set Asides, again, which is why it's on the timeline. And again, another strong indicator that Medicare is sitting with this issue and trying to work through in order to put together some rules and regulations. Ultimately, that was withdrawn, amended first and ultimately withdrawn because, again, Medicare doesn't quite understand the nuances of an insurance settlement and how it takes place, and what seemingly looks like a little thing as far as a couple points of data would be potentially disastrous on getting an insurance settlement done. So again, they were alerted to this and made some changes. But nonetheless, it was yet another point in time where Medicare is trying to put together some rules and regulations around liability compliance specifically. This is a separate slide, and I wanted to kind of separate it out because this is very recent information regarding liability MSAs. So you see in December of 2018, we're going to have Medicare take another bite at the apple. They're going to get back in there and see if they can put together some rules for compliance on liability side. On the liability side again, and they said to be expecting this early in the new year of 2019. Well, as you all know, that time has come and gone, and we still are waiting, right? but that shows that they're, again, trying to get together and put some rules in place for compliance. And please don't lose sight of the fact that throughout this whole process, even still, as nothing tangible or concrete has come out of these attempts, right, we still refer back to the federal statute that says you must consider Medicare's interests in liability cases. And in reading through the federal statute on that first slide, it says Medicare cannot make a payment when there's another source available. So we still must consider Medicare's interests in these cases, even in the absence of formal concrete guidelines. So we move down to the second bullet on this slide. September of 2019, very recent, they issued another notice. Are you starting to notice a theme here? Where they said to expect some guidelines or some proposed rules throughout this process in October of 2019. Well, today is the tail end of November of 2019, and still we have nothing to show for it, right? And very, very recently, actually, just as of this week, as a matter of fact, so was able to make it into this slide, so very timely, Medicare issued another announcement, another slight amendment, again, through this process to say, well, we didn't quite make the timeline that we intended for, and we're going to kick the can on down the road, so let's shoot for February of 2020. No one hold your breath for February of 2020 if you haven't seen how this has played out over the last handful of years. But the thing to keep in mind is, as you see in that quote down at the very bottom, is that MSP compliance is a very, very real thing to consider in liability cases. So I wanted to give you this information or this timeline so that if you have these conversations with trial attorneys or your colleagues that you're helping advise on these potential settlements in the liability side, if you get the comment about Medicare Set Asides is for work comp claims, nothing to do with liability, I don't have to do this, Medicare's never said anything, you can help kind of rearrange that line of thinking a little bit to say, well, actually the federal statute does not discriminate, and also we've seen that Medicare is actually taking steps to help put some guidelines in place, but even in the absence of those strong guidelines, we still must consider Medicare's interest per that federal statute. And we'll also see some other more impactful points here coming up on the slides soon. So, speaking of impactful points to talk to your trial attorney colleagues about, what I wanted to share about this is, again, 2 points. Number one, the Medicare Secondary Payer Statute, again, is kind of twofold, right? It's thinking about past payments, liens, conditional payments that you must reimburse out of the settlement proceeds, and then future medical considerations, thinking about planning for their future Medicare allowable expenses post-settlement, which are all things to be contemplated inside of a Medicare Set-Aside arrangement. Nonetheless, that all ties back to the same federal statute. And that's important because, as you see towards the bottom there, very, very recently we've seen Medicare go after their recovery rights or increase their recovery efforts, is what I'm trying to say, in personal injury cases, and they've gone after conditional payments. So, yes, granted, there has not been a case yet where plaintiff attorneys have been tagged for compliance issues over Medicare Set Aside specifically on futures, but that's because Medicare can go after essentially the low-hanging fruit, where it's easier to go after their recovery rights on past payments. And we see that now, where there's actually been plaintiff firms that have had to pay for compliance issues on their failure to reimburse Medicare or consider their interest on their past payments. So again, very real issue and very strong indicator that Medicare secondary payer compliance on liability cases is very real, and it's only evolving into something that is going to be the norm. So it's something that, again, should be very much an instrumental part of your planning process when you're thinking about injury victims' public benefits. Take a quick pause here for the next MCLE code. It is 0159. So moving right along, we started with the federal statute. We moved down to a quick kind of outline of what a Medicare Set Aside is, given a little bit of commentary about liability, Medicare Set Asides, or MSP compliance on the liability side from Medicare specifically. And now I want to talk about just pragmatic steps that you can think about implementing into your workflow when you're working with trial attorneys on solving these public benefit issues. So step one would be verifying the Social Security Medicare entitlement, as well as starting a search for liens. So in this process, we're basically uncovering who are the players? What are the government benefits that the injury victim has access to? We want to start there because we can't form preservation game plans without knowing exactly what benefits the individual may have access to. And this is a great way to engage with trial attorneys early into the process and help be a real partner to influence how the settlement is going to unfold and thereby protect the individual's public benefits, whether they be means-tested benefits like SSI or Medi-Cal out here in California, Medicaid, or earned-based benefits like SSDI or Medicare. For purposes of the MSA world, we care about earned-based benefits, right? SSDI and Medicare. We care about SSDI because the way that the system is set up is once an individual has been awarded SSDI benefits, after 30 months they get rolled onto Medicare Part A at minimum. So that is a trigger essentially for considering Medicare's interest because they are soon to be eligible to draw on Medicare's coffers. And again, in the quote down there in the bottom, this is a great opportunity to engage with your trial attorney colleagues early in the process and expand that conversation from what is a lightning rod right now, MSAs, good, bad, or indifferent, but expand that conversation from MSAs to public benefit preservation in totality, which is far more important than helping trial attorneys just understand how to get around the MSA issue potentially. So step 2, we have started in step 1 and we are trying to understand what public benefits are at stake. We move to step 2 and we'll assume that the individual has either SSDI benefits or they're on Medicare or they have a reasonable expectation to be on Medicare within 30 months. And those are usually the big 3 common triggers. Nonetheless, if you're looking for a complete list of considerations on thinking about MSAs, feel free to contact the folks here for this program, and we'll be happy to provide the necessary content for like a takeaway material. So when we're thinking about building out Medicare Set Asides, again, MSAs are basically a 2-pronged test, right? They are thinking about medical expenses that are directly tied to the injury sustained, so nothing pre-existing or unrelated. And then 2, they're otherwise Medicare allowable expenses. Medicare pays for a lot, but not everything. Common question I get a lot is, will an MSA, is the MSA basically a life care plan, or how do those two work together? The best way that I can put it is that an MSA is a great thing to support a life care plan. It does not supplant a life care plan. They are different, and they should serve 2 different purposes. Although they are both estimating future medical costs, they can certainly help the trial attorney while they're working on, an equitable solution for a settlement. But the MSA is very, very narrow and nuanced in what it's going to contemplate, and it will not cover all of the future medical considerations for the individual. Thinking about building out Medicare Set Aside reports, there's a couple of key things to consider. We always want to get a rated age life expectancy on the individual. The rated age is basically going to serve as the timeline for applying future cost projections. So just as a rough example, if an individual is chronologically 65 years old, however, when we're getting a rated age, we rate the whole person, not the injury. So I know it's a little bit different to think about because the MSA, right, is only contemplating medical expenses tied to the injury only over which the lawsuit occurred. But the rated age life expectancy is going to rate the entire person. So if they're a smoker, if they have a history of diabetes, they have other, history of family ailments, or they're obese, or whatever the situation is, the rated age rates the entire person. So if they're chronologically 65, maybe you can get a rated age life expectancy from a life company that says maybe they're more like 75. And you can use that rated age and apply that to making projection decisions so that you have an accurate representation on a timeline that you're going to be making allocation decisions, but automatically it will reduce the amount of years that you're going to have to be putting medical costs and real dollars from the settlement into an MSA. So the rated age life expectancy is key. Just very easy example, what's needed to really build out an MSA report. Obviously, you'll need some intake information. You typically want a snapshot of the last 2 to 5 years of medical records. A quick note on that, most allocators will want and require the medical records themselves. A lot of times we get questions to say, can you use a life care plan to develop an MSA? Or maybe perhaps you have a great deposition from an expert. Can you apply that information to building out a Medicare Set Aside? And it'll probably vary across the board depending on who's writing the allocation ultimately, but just a little bit of food for thought. As a conservative move, typically an allocator should want to base their decision off of the medical records for one major reason. In the event of a post-settlement audit by Medicare, first and foremost, you want to make sure you work with someone that guarantees their work product so that you have a buffer between Medicare and yourself going forward for these type of considerations. But number two, in that event of an audit, Medicare will disregard any and all things other than the medical records. So of course you're going to want to base your decision off of information that is going to be considered fair game if you ever have to defend your decision-making processes. And then of course, if there's prescription records available, and then the last item there is indemnity and payouts, which is something to consider for work comp, nothing about personal injury cases. So basically you need some general intake information, 2 to 5 years of medical records, and if there's some supporting information like life care plans or expert documents, that you can probably fold that into the process, but I would advise not to found your decision off of those items alone. This is a quick flowchart. I don't expect anybody to be able to read through this in the few seconds we have, but nonetheless, I want to remind you that you should have this as an available takeaway to stick in a file and have available to you about Medicare Set Asides, and kind of like a quick decision matrix on the front, on the top side, and then on the bottom is kind of like a look behind the curtain on the allocation building process. So good information to have handy for whenever you are faced with these types of questions. Just some general things to consider if someone's asking you to review an MSA or asking you questions about, what are some key triggers inside of an MSA. This is just a quick little list that most people find helpful. As I mentioned before, the MSA reports are two silos, right? They're medical expenses and drug expenses. When you're thinking about the prescriptions out of the MSA, if any of you have seen Medicare Set Asides, you've probably seen that these accounts can balloon very quickly, and it's mostly placed inside the drug. So you probably want to take a sharper focus on the prescription expenses that are contemplated, and some things are what's prescribed versus what is filled. Sometimes you want to make sure if you can see a good trending or a good history in the fill records, maybe you want to reflect that in your allocation decisions. Brand versus generic, dosages, off-label uses, price per pill, all those types of things are very, very important to make an accurate assessment, and again, be as mindful as possible to not hoard unnecessary dollars out of a settlement into an MSA. Rated age life expectancy, we've already talked about that. That's key for a timeline on attaching these projections with medical expenses to it. Thinking about who you're working with. If you're going to write one yourself, understand what you're taking on, globally what you're taking on. If you're going to partner with someone, make sure that they bind themselves to their work product so that you do have a transfer of risk and that they are going to be defending their work product should there ever be a post-settlement audit for Medicare. Pricing and timelines matched with fee schedules. Again, if you have ever written an MSA or if you've worked with someone that does write MSAs, a lot of times you have the ability to make decisions within a range. So understanding the decision-making process within the ranges that you have to work with and applying that into an MSA. And of course, fee schedules, right? Very, very direct. What things cost can vary depending on where you're going to be able to procure them from. So, being mindful of the dollars you're putting into an MSA, thinking about fee schedules is a major part of that process. And the last one, just thinking about denied care of body parts that aren't necessarily related. Keep in mind, the MSA, again, is only for thinking about expenses directly related to the injuries in the claim. So it's nothing that's pre-existing or unrelated should never be found inside of an MSA. And that can get very gray, right, when you're thinking about causation versus exacerbation issues, like, say, on a med-mal claim, perhaps. So something to keep in mind. CMS submission. This is a big, big topic that always gets brought up. So as you'll see in the bottom in big bold letters, the CMS submission program is 100% voluntary, regardless if it's a work comp claim or if it's a liability case. So that means that you are never compelled to submit an MSA for approval. Also, we strongly advise that you refrain from the CMS submission process, especially on the liability side, for a few reasons. Number one, of course, you don't have to do it. Number two, today, as I talked to in November of 2019, Medicare is not really reviewing liability MSAs. That may change in the future, given what's going on and some of the changes that potentially may be made. But as it stands right now, Medicare is not really reviewing liability MSAs. So you don't have to do it. They're not really looking at liability MSAs. And then the third reason, on the off chance that a reviewer picks up the liability MSA that you submitted, the cost benefit of that is definitely not in any of the stakeholders' favors. Number one, it takes a lot of time. And as you all know, if you're working on insurance settlements or working with trial attorneys, time is key. Timing is everything a lot of times. And the CMS submission process is a long process. And also, what you might get back is a inflated number than what you had agreed to in the beginning, and that could definitely derail a potential settlement. So instead, to transfer any perceived risk, the way to solve for that is, again, on the front side, choosing the right allocator that binds themselves to their work and will guarantee the work that they do. But then secondly, as we're going to talk about now, you want to have these MSA accounts administered by a professional administrator, and that serves as the risk transfer. In Medicare's eyes, the person or entity that is holding or custodying the MSA dollars is on the hook for responsible distribution-making decisions. So you, the injury victim, your client, the personal injury attorney, you all can look at professional administration as a transfer of risk. So thinking about MSP compliance, it is a half-baked idea for compliance if you have all the work of doing the MSA and then you turn over this sum of money to a lay person to administer it themselves. So step 3, arrange for proper administration. As I mentioned before, the third step is administration, and it's certainly the most crucial for the most importantly, the fact that it can serve as a transfer of risk for the stakeholders within the settlement. And of course, the injury victim that has the administrator, they get a benefit in that they are basically tied to a medical claims advocate to shepherd them through the process of compliance, getting them discounts on goods and services, and also handling all of the reporting requirements going on with Medicare. We'll pause now for the third MCLE code. It is 9150. All right, continuing on. So when you're thinking about administration options, there are basically 3 options. There's professional administration, having an expert do that on behalf of the claimant. Self-administration kit or assistance is basically like a safety net for the individual where the claimant is going to have access to the money, so they will be the ones technically administering. However, they have a support system in place that they can lean on for any type of help and assistance. Now, it's worth mentioning, as I have in the parentheses there, that if there is a special needs trust established, the MSA must be embedded inside of the S&T or at least pass through the special needs trust. We'll talk about that in a moment. And for those reasons, they can't self-administer, just the same as a claimant could not self-administer their own special needs trust. And then the last bullet, of course, if we're not thinking about setting up a special needs trust and there is just an MSA standing alone by itself per se, they technically do have the available option to self-administer, although it certainly would not behoove anyone, especially the claimant. So what's the role of the professional administrator, right? What could you expect from the person or entity that's going to be responsible for making distribution decisions out of the MSA? And basically it boils down to a couple key things. Number one, they'll save the claimant money. Everyone loves saving money, and that's super important. They'll also handle what we refer to at Medivest as a coordination of benefits. And I think that's key. As important as it is as saving money, perhaps one of the biggest value, the great pieces of value that we can deliver to the people that we serve and work with is the coordination of benefits is essentially becoming the backstop for coordinating their care. So you can, in an example, it's not uncommon that an injury victim will have perhaps a Medicare Set Aside that's going to be primary to Medicare. They'll have Medicare benefits, and then perhaps they have insurance through a spouse, or perhaps they have a special needs trust. There's essentially multiple buckets, right, for future care. The administrator or the appropriate administrator will basically take on that whole process of coordinating care, understanding who pays what, who can't pay on behalf of the claimant, so that you're not just administering the MSA. In fact, you're helping coordinate all of their future care between the available options. And that's huge. It's a huge burden lifted off someone's shoulders, but it's also of great value to the administrator as well, so that they understand exactly where the bills are coming from and where they should be paid. And then the last there in bold, of course, like we already talked about, it can serve as a risk transfer for the stakeholders in the settlement, which is vital, to say the least. There's a flowchart here for professional administration, just like the MSA flowchart. I don't expect anyone to be able to read through this. However, I wanted to give a reminder that it will be a part of the takeaway items that you can have handy, having a file available for your use later on down the road. So a quick note about means-tested benefits and earned benefits. Since we are, this is the audience we're talking to, when we want to engage with trial attorneys, like I mentioned when we started, the MSA issue is a lightning rod, good, bad, or indifferent, but hopefully they can allow you to engage early and often with trial attorneys and then expand that conversation from MSA to public benefits in totality. So what happens if an individual is considered dual eligible, where they have means-tested benefits like in this slide, as well as earned-based benefits like in the next slide. So typically means-tested benefits, although it's not a one-size-fit-all type of solution, but a lot of times the proceeds from a settlement for an individual that has means-tested benefits will be sheltered inside of a special needs trust so that they can retain their eligibility, but also allow to take receipt of that settlement and have the settlement come to fruition. Now, earned-based benefits like Medicare and SSDI, those are the types of benefits that we care about for MSA considerations. Now, if an individual has those types of benefits at stake in their settlement, you'll probably have some iteration of a Medicare Set Aside completed. Now, the way that these two, the MSA and the Special Needs Trust, work in tandem is that the MSA, no matter how large or small the amount is, it's always considered an available resource against their means-tested benefits. So the MSA dollars should be either embedded inside of the Special Needs Trust or at least go through the trust and then have the trustee still the owner of those dollars, but then have a professional administrator as a custody agent, essentially, to help them administer the MSA portion. And an extended benefit of working with the trustee that also is going to be working with a professional administrator is that professional administrator, if they're doing their job well, they should also be a great partner to handle all medical expenses. So even if the trust has to contemplate some medical care that the MSA can't, the administrator will help guide them through that process on where payment can be made, but also they'll help them preserve corpus because they'll have the ability to adjudicate claims and reduce the cost of care, so that regardless if it's the MSA or the S&T making the payment for the bill, it will be a service for the member and obviously a service for the trustee as well. So as I mentioned, MSAs and dual eligible individuals, the MSA must work in concert with the Special Needs Trust because the MSA amount is always considered a countable resource. As a quick review, step one being verify what public benefits are at stake, right? This is a great way to engage with trial attorneys early and often to help them uncover public benefit issues. If you do this type of work now, or you have some colleagues that do, it's not uncommon to know that they will need some help or assistance on trying to decipher the difference between SSI or SSDI or Medicare or Medi-Cal. They need a support system in place to help them understand what public benefits are at stake and then apply preservation game plans to help them get through that settlement without derailing their public benefit programs. If an individual does have Medicare or SSDI benefits in this scenario today, step two would be work with the appropriate person or company to help create a Medicare Set Aside or some iteration thereof. We could certainly have a webinar 2.0 on all things about building out MSAs. They are certainly not widgets. They are always contingent upon what the settlement and the figures are showing us. And then, of course, the third step would be arranging for proper administration and not turning over that sum of money with specific rules on how to spend it over to a layperson. Work with a professional administrator. If there's a special needs trust involved, or even if there's not, the professional administrator can be a great support system to, again, decrease exposure for the stakeholders in the settlement, but also really do right by the claimants on helping them stretch those dollars further, coordinate their care, and work with the providers on their behalf so that they don't have to have those stresses and they can worry about their quality of life instead. So that concludes. I think hopefully there's time for a Q&A, or if there's any questions, please put them into the chat box, and I'd love to answer those questions at this time.
Fantastic. So, Amy, just here, do we have any questions?
About, 6 or 7 questions.
Okay. Well,
Yeah, fine.
let's just see how we did. Okay. Well, go ahead, and I'm going to join you for this. Okay.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Okay, Amy.
Okay. Can someone just opt out of taking Medicare?
Yeah. Can you just say, I just don't want the Medicare. Let's just not do this at all.
So, sure. I would say maybe if you get that question, there's probably a little more behind it, and they may not understand really the cost benefit behind of opting out. If that's tied to wanting to circumvent an MSA because of whatever reason, then hopefully that would be the perfect opportunity to help them understand that if you can get Medicare benefits, why not get them and keep them, both financially and for health care, for all those reasons, and then don't let a Medicare set aside or considering Medicare's interest be the reason to have you roll that dice or forfeit that benefit, because it is a benefit nonetheless. And this whole exercise in MSP compliance certainly can be done, is done every single day to where it does not derail a settlement. So if your concern is really derailing a settlement, or perhaps if it's coming from the claimant, worrying about their overall net, what they take home, which is very important.
Sure.
The MSA still will not stand in the way of that. And as I mentioned, there could be a whole session on MSA 2.0 on all the ways that we can build out these MSAs, because they are not widgets. That there are ways to make sure that we're mindful of the claimant's net, debt, liens, whatever the case is, but still consider Medicare's interest and show how we've done so that they have the best of both worlds.
So, to make sure that I understand, let's say, because sometimes it's hard to control a client. So
Yeah, that should be a webinar.
That's a webinar. Yeah, a webinar on how do you control a client. I would attend that webinar. But if somebody were to just opt out of the Medicare, can you just opt back in? Or and I'm assuming it's just not that simple. If you were to, let's say you were to opt out, then what would you do in the future? Or
well, it becomes very very tricky, to say the least, especially when you're thinking about opting in, opting out, time goes on, post-settlement. This whole issue, this statute of considering Medicare's interest as a secondary payer for specific injury-related expenses doesn't go away after 3 months or 3 years or whatever timetable you want to apply to it. So if things change down the road and you decide, wow, having Medicare would be a major quality of life boon for me, maybe do the work today when you're thinking about your settlement to make sure you always have that option available to you, as opposed to forfeiting that today and then things changing, and it's going to be messy, to say the least, to try to reconcile all that down the road.
I know a lot of the cases we're involved with, and just as a special needs attorney here and as a trustee, we're always working post-settlement. So I know sometimes to the plaintiff, the client, they're oftentimes surprised that this even comes up, which probably as part of this is the answer is probably better preparation of the client. But I know I've had a lot of cases where they're just shocked that this even came up, and so it can be kind of contentious.
Absolutely, and I think success in my mind are the members and the people that belong to the association tuning in, that you can use this as the MSA lightning rod, as I say, as a way to help be the one to engage with the council earlier, and you can be the sphere of influence essentially, or at least be the one advising the sphere of influence, so that they can be mindful of these potential landmines earlier, as opposed to stepping outside at mediation and trying to get it done in 2 minutes. So that's best practices, but as you say, we live in an imperfect world, and as far as the MSA issue goes, as we've worked on in the past, let's say the trust is funded, settlements done, everyone's gone their separate ways, and either you that wrote the trust or the trustee finds something along there that says, wow, I really think we need to consider Medicare's interest. We can still help at that point. And then hopefully the next time around, we can go back to that trial attorney and, very diplomatically plan for a different scenario in the future.
Great. Amy?
Okay. What if a MSA beneficiary uses less Medicare than expected? Can you unwind it?
Very good question. So typically, there's two ways that money comes out of the MSA. Once you've basically opted into this, right, the money comes out either on a appropriate expense, or you pass away and the money that's left over should be going to your estate or deemed beneficiary, whomever. Be mindful of something called reversionary agreements, and that's basically just a language slipped in by carriers that would say in the event someone passes away, the medical dollars revert back to the carrier, to the life company, if it's funded in an annuity. Very easy to beat back. That makes 0 sense at all. It's the claimant's money. They get to choose what they get to do with it. So that aside, if you have an individual that has sum of money in the MSA and they're not really spending it down, that should be relatively rare for a couple of reasons. Number one, the front end underwriting side, it should be a pretty accurate representation of what their future medical looks like. Although healthcare is volatile, you get sick, you get healthy. But secondly, for personal injury work, again, this is the MSA 2.0 thing, talking about how MSAs are built out. But what's commonplace for liability work is that you would have a MSA done initially and think about it as fully valued, for lack of a better term. Well, we want to, use the unique settlement variables that are applied in that case and basically take a reduced share just like everyone and everything else in that case. So if you had an initial MSA hypothetically for $100,000, maybe for all things considered, value, what actually settled, comparative negligence, policy issues, all things, we get that MSA reduced down to $40,000, as an example. So really what that indicates is you're more likely to spend through that money at a faster rate than you are to just sit with it and never use it, because you're probably setting aside a reduced share from the beginning as opposed to overfunding. So between accurate underwriting on the front end and then oftentimes taking somewhat of a reduced share at the end of the day, you really shouldn't be finding yourself in a situation where you're just sitting with cash that could be better utilized elsewhere.
Cool. What else we got?
Then we kind of have the opposite side. What if they use more Medicare than expected? Is there a penalty?
Yeah, so the idea with these Medicare Set Aside arrangements is not to build or preserve wealth, right? You don't necessarily. It's not one of those situations where it's like, don't touch the principal. The MSA money should be spent down. That's the idea. And we want to spend it down because if we can spend it down, and the key is doing it appropriately, so that when Medicare gets to do kind of their final glorified audit, their look back to see how money was spent, once they give that the okay, then Medicare surfaces as primary indefinitely to cover expenses. So the key is to utilize the money, get it spent down. It just has to be spent appropriately, and that's a win, because we don't necessarily want to make this MSA account stretch until someone's last breath. We just want to spend it on appropriate expenses so that this whole exercise of primary, secondary can conclude, but conclude in a way that Medicare agrees to surface as primary going forward.
And I think I've told you this before. There's a part of the administration in this thing that, to me, that is a total mystery. I keep thinking I've got this thing nailed. And Shelley and I, and anybody who deals with GSPT knows Shelley, we play this game when there's a request to go, are they going to pay it or are they not going to pay it? And we're right about 60% of the time. It's
a good batting average.
So to me, it's a complete mystery when a request is made, because Medivest they are our administrator on the cases we have here. As far as what is paid and what isn't paid, this is something that I guess guessing just doesn't do it, right? Or it seems to me in some cases common sense doesn't seem to be what drives this. But
healthcare doesn't seem to fall into the common sense category. But I think probably the best thing on that end is, it's prudent on your program's part to not take that exposure on, and you outsource it onto someone like us.
There's no way.
So, at the end of the day, whatever decision we make, we're going to stand by that and be prepared to defend our decision-making process. And, thinking about liability cases, the theme of today, it isn't necessarily black and white, right? You have, causation, exacerbation issues, how much is too much, how frequency. I mean, it's nuanced, but at the end of the day, if our claims team says, this is something that's appropriate, we're going to stand by it, and we'd be the ones to deal with any potential repercussions that would come down.
So next question.
Well, you talked about it a little bit. The question came up about audits. When do they happen? You mentioned it in your last question, but not to the extent.
Is anybody watching these things? I guess.
Yeah.
Do they get audited during the administration? Because to my knowledge, we've never been audited on the cases we've worked with you.
That's a good thing.
That doesn't mean that anything goes. And I take it that you had mentioned that there's a post.
Right. So there's a couple of inflection points to where someone's watching, or there is compliance that you need to be mindful of. And the first one being that mandatory insurer reporting requirement. So if we had this discussion, which we probably did 5-6 years ago, we would probably be a little bit more liberal in some of the strategies we might think about. But with the reporting requirement in place, that means Medicare is getting the claim information. They are being put on notice of a settlement taking place, and we saw in that timeline there was a couple points where they were trying to implement some data points to specifically talk about MSAs and then specific medical codes in MSAs or dollar amounts, and that's kind of been beaten back because of it'd be nasty ripple effect to just get a settlement done. But Medicare's aware of your case; they're aware of a settlement taking place. And then the big point, part of having an MSA is there's a reporting requirement that they call annual attestation. It's just a fancy way of saying, give me an accounting of anything in and out of the account on an annual basis. And of course, you need to be prepared to be able to reconcile, what you've done. If you can't pay your mortgage out of the MSA, that's a problem. Also, equally as much of a problem, because it's not a sliding scale of forgiveness, if you just use it as a general medical slush fund. So if you went and got hearing aids or home modifications or unskilled nursing care, high ticket item, not a Medicare allowable expense, and if you paid for those things out of the MSA, you're just as much out of compliance, and there's a problem there. So between the reporting of having to basically audit yourself and say, hey, I had a $50,000 MSA, now it's at 42, here's where the $8,000 went, and they get to say, was that appropriate or not? But also, even if you're not going to do the self-reporting, because there's a lot of folks out there that maybe are self-administering and just don't do it, you'll also see there's a bunch of blog posts out there. Of course, we can supply your association with that information too. But Medicare is denying payments now, which again, 5-6 years ago, that wasn't really happening. They are now denying care because they are saying we should not be the primary payer. For a long time, it was eventually the left hand talks to the right hand, where Medicare will pay for things because they're good at paying for things. And eventually they'll send out a nasty letter that says, we think we're going to suspend your benefits because we paid for these things. Here's a dollar figure attached to it. Now it's your responsibility to either refute it or accept it. They're starting to get up to speed now where they might actually catch you on the front end to say, we're going to deny. We don't think we should be paying for this. It should be paid from some other source where you had a settlement in November of 2019. So this is all to say that Medicare finding out about your needle of a case in a huge haystack across the country is they are implementing processes so that it isn't just purely Scouts Honor anymore. There are real repercussions.
And this is a change. I mean,
absolutely.
I know we've been doing these for years, and I know the answer is different. Maybe any other questions?
Yeah, what if a plaintiff refuses to accept an MSA?
Yeah.
What does the attorney do?
Lead a horse to water, can't make him drink. So
probably document.
Absolutely. So I can't think of a better term off the top of my head, so I'll just say it. But we can help with CYA letters, and essentially it's basically saying we're going to have this conversation. We're going to give you all of the information and the resources to find this information and confirm this information, and you understand the decision that you're making. You understand the potential consequences of this decision. We sign, you sign, we all sign, so that down the road, if Medicare benefits get suspended or they get a nasty letter about needing to pay back money, typically the first phone call is their representation, not a nice one, and you at least have something to refer them back to say, I tried to help you, you made this decision.
So you would put that on the top of the file.
Yeah, as the last piece of that before you put it away.
Anyway,
so, I mean, as a follow-on, so can the attorney be liable?
Well, so when we're thinking about futures, the plaintiff attorney or like a trust attorney that maybe gets involved?
Well, let's not pick on the trust attorney. How about the plaintiff attorney?
I They didn't say, but I
Sure.
think it's the plaintiff attorney.
Okay, so as you saw in one of those slides, right? Very recently, have we started? This is also a new thing. We've started to see Medicare enforce their recovery rights with conditional payments, liens, right? And plaintiff firms, plaintiff attorneys have had to pay various amounts of money. You see in one of those slides for failure to consider their interests and protect their reimbursement rights. Now, as we talk today, there hasn't been that scenario over an MSA, but
But there has been on not protecting Medicare's interests, right?
right, and that's whether we're talking about past payments or future considerations, right? It's the same statute that they're utilizing to go after now, which is very new. Plaintiff attorneys, which for right now it's about liens, past payments, but thinking about futures, even what's more likely to happen right now is if you fail to do something, or at least fail to put your client on notice so they're aware, problems will ensue. Medicare will suspend benefits or deny payments for things. The member will, or the claimant will go back to their attorney, what's going on, and threaten malpractice and a whole big problem. And that's what we're all trying to avoid here. Is just let's take some practical steps to avoid from that problem popping up down the road.
Okay, I think you covered this, but I'll ask it again. What if an individual is on SSI and Medi-Cal? Do they still need an MSA?
So, and that's a good question, because here in California, I believe, look what I'm saying next to. You get if you qualify for $1 for SSI, you automatically qualify for Medi-Cal.
That's one way of qualifying. So part of it is what's called categorical eligibility, but although they could drop the SSI and then they'd have to qualify separately.
Right.
And so the rules are similar, not exactly the same.
I don't envy you because you deal with state programs. I deal with a federal program. But as far as MSA considerations go, means-tested benefits, SSI, Medi-Cal, Medicaid, other places in the country, that is not a trigger to consider a Medicare Set Aside because those two programs are different, kind of never the two shall meet, essentially. And this whole Medicare Set Aside arrangement, right, is a process put in place to help preserve the Medicare coffers. So unless an individual has a reasonable expectation to be able to draw down on the Medicare coffers, typically within 30 months of settlement, then we don't need to go through this exercise, essentially.
And I try to monitor the cases. By the way, you guys have some marvelous newsletters and things like that. I actually read them on occasion, so I know that's how I keep up to date on these things. But this hasn't come up yet to my knowledge, but Medi-Cal is a payer, and so is SSI, is a payer of last resort here. So Medi-Cal is a payer of last resort. I would think that there would be a problem if somehow you opted not to do, or that wouldn't even make sense. If you opted not to take the Medicare, you could have a problem with your Medi-Cal, but you'd also be taking the funds, you'd have too many resources. So that's just a silly question, now that I think it through. This stuff is confusing. But related to that is, and I know you did cover this, but let's just, in fact, this might be a good thing to finish up on. If you are on SSI and Medi-Cal, right, and it's worth preserving, because sometimes it's not, then the MSA would go into a self-settled trust, right, for which we have a self-settled trust here. But there's a few quirky rules in it, one of which is, has this changed? You can't actually use the money for the administration of the MSA, which,
right.
Has that changed, or have they come to their senses? That doesn't make any sense at all.
It does not.
Joe.
It does not, Stephen, and bless you, for saying that. So, the world we live in today, the fee, any fee, any fee for administration of the MSA, but also any fee in general, cannot be taken from within the MSA account to pay for the administration of the account, which is, like you mentioned, totally ridiculous. We have our little trade associations of professionals and nurses and all that, and we keep knocking on the door with Medicare. We have Medicare representatives come to our meetings now, which is a small step in the right direction. But if you think about this, we're essentially, you have a whole industry of compliance partners out there, right? So if you turn over a $100,000 MSA to a layperson, they're either going to mess it up or they're going to blow through it fast, or both. If you make sure and remove a burden to place it in the hands of a professional administrator, you're going to stretch those dollars further. You're going to make sure they're in compliance. So ultimately, you move the needle of preserving Medicare trust fund dollars and not sending people back onto the program faster, right? So just give a little bit and you get more. But somehow that message hasn't broken through just yet. So they do throw us a bone and allow for like postage fees and stamps to come out of an MSA. But the fee for administration cannot come out of the set aside today.
Okay. And then, Amy, was that the last?
That was the last one.
So just one last thing on this, and then once again, I know this is an ever-evolving area. So with the trust, we can't use the trust funds, and if we're holding the MSA in the trust funds, we can't use the trust funds to manage the MSA, or at least those that are dedicated to the MSA.
You can use
use
money outside of the MSA
outside of that
to pay the admin fee, but you can't use the MSA dollars.
So, and what we do at the Golden State Pool Trust, other people do it differently. We have a separate MSA trust just so we don't get confused. And in that trust specifically, it says that you cannot use it for administrative fees. So here's the last thing, and then I think we'll call it quits for the day. It sure seems like the structured settlement industry sure is all over these things. So a little bit about structures tied to MSAs. How does that work?
Yeah, well, a couple things. Operationally, right? When you're thinking about a settlement, right, and then all of a sudden now you have this like carve out from the settlement of amount of money. Well, structured settlements can be a great idea, but it's not a one size fit all. I can feel my cell phone blowing up now with half of the brokers yelling at me. But it is not a one-size-fit-all service or product. However, so hopefully I'll bat some of these calls back, the funding of Medicare Set Aside with a structured settlement annuity is almost always a great idea, because you think about the intention of that money is it's predestined medical dollars, so you know that it's set aside for a specific purpose, right? You can't pay down debt or buy a house or go do whatever. It's intended for a specific purpose. Now, if you have a $100,000 MSA obligation, perhaps you can purchase an annuity today for $70,000, $60,000, and meet that $100,000 obligation down the road. So you're recycling money back into the settlement, which if you're working with a trust, that's actually a little bit of a bridge to be built, because you might be able to put more money into the trust and fund it better if you at least structure the MSA, not necessarily the entire settlement. The second piece is thinking about MSAs funded with structures. A great thing that we have available to us is if we get to a period where the annuity stream has been exhausted and the account is temporarily insolvent while we're waiting for the next annuity stream, as long as the money was spent appropriately, right, that's the key, Medicare will surface on an interim basis and pay those expenses not on a lien. So that's a great way to stretch those MSA accounts too if you fund it in annual installments, because if you spin the stream down, then Medicare picks up the tab, then the next annuity stream comes in, they go back down to 2, then we have money to pay for it. So it is another tool to help stretch those MSA dollars further. So there's one. Structured settlement world obviously sees the MSA as another opportunity, which makes sense and is a good thing, right, to fund these accounts with structured settlement annuities. So of course that industry at whole will be very, very involved and engaged with the MSA process. So that's probably the biggest reason, and that's probably why you see settlement consultants on this MSA piece. But then also if you work in insurance settlements as well, you understand that structured settlement consultants, they make their living on being the ones that make, influence decisions in a settlement, and this is yet another piece that goes into a settlement plan. So of course that they will be heavily engaged with dealing with the MSA issue as well. Sounds terrific.
Anyway, once again, Joe, I want to thank you so much for coming, and doing this presentation today and bringing us up to date here. And those of you that are watching, keep in mind this is accredited for a unit of MCLE credit. To get that credit, you would you would email Amy, so that'd be AMY at GSPT.org. And I think with that, and I would mention here, DJ, do we have the last slide up for folks?
Yes.
Here, and I'll see if I can do your job for you, Guy. I will say that whether you use Medivest or you use a lesser organization, but no matter what you do here, actually, Medivest has a lot of good information. I know we get a lot of good postings here from time to time. And if you want to keep up on this, and if you're an attorney who's doing special needs trusts and working with settlements, I will tell you, despite the fact I'm doing this for a long time, I know enough to be dangerous. This is something you want to be on top of, and you certainly want to partner with somebody who's knowledgeable. So I would expect, unless you tell me this is a bad idea, you might want to email Joe here and get on the list to keep up to date with what's
Absolutely.
going on.
Yeah, great way.
And the price is right. So far I haven't gotten a bill, so it works out great. And by the way, just as an aside, they on the GSPT, Medivest does our compliance for us. So once again, they've done a terrific job. Nothing bad has happened yet. So
We thank you. We thank you for that very much.
Okay, with that, I want to thank you so much and happy advocating.